Hello there. I am feeling so fired up about today's topic. I'm so excited to have you here with me because we are going to be talking about Mars retrograde today, and this is a transit. The whole concept of it really is longing for a rewrite. It deserves the poetry and conversation that is underlying it. And I have found that this is a transit that's not very well understood. And if you are just beginning, in astrology and you haven't connected with these archetypes or energetics before, and you were to Google search Mars retrograde, you would find a lot of, I think, very overwhelming conversations that retell a lot of very traumatic and stress-based stories. And I find that problematic, and also it doesn't really get to the core of what we're talking about. It's kind of just like looking at these really vague, superficial things and not really taking a moment to slow down enough to look. I think Mars retrograde also reflects, in the way it's written about, it reflects our own culture's fears around growth and change and time and self-worth and all of these things. And so we want to really take the time to dive deep into this conversation and do the story writing that it requires. And that's what we are going to do here today, because a lot of times what you will see is conversations around Mars retrograde being about if you want to start something new, or if you want to begin and open up, this is a bad time to do it. Bad things will happen to you. It will fall apart. You'll have to start over. It's going to feel horrible. You'll see a lot of stories telling you that. You'll also have a lot of stories telling you that if Mars can't be direct, getting out there, because Mars is associated with motivation, movement, desire, making things happen, that it will get internalized and become passive aggression or manipulation and emotional manipulation. And I am just here to say that those things, we can take them off the table right now. In fact, I want you to pretend like I didn't even ever say those things. Like, we are going to be meeting Mars and Mars retrograde for the first time. And as we move forward over the next several months, we're going to be working with this energetic, and I want this to be a time of empowerment. I would also say on a personal level that Mars retrograde for me has been a time of very positive changes historically. I remember 2 Mars retrogrades ago, which was in 2018. I left my job in library science, which was really, really scary, but also one of the best decisions I ever made. In the Mars retrograde in 2020, in Aries, I got married during that Mars retrograde, and it was one of the best decisions of my life with a really, really beautiful partner. And so it's also just untrue that this is a negative time to begin new things. It can be actually one of the best times to begin things and to become more fully yourself, and to also acknowledge how far you have come. But we're going to get into that as we move through this conversation. So let's just get the basics down. Like I mentioned, the last Mars retrograde we had was in 2020. It was in the sign of Aries. It went between September 9th and November 13th. So one thing that's kind of fun, Mars doesn't retrograde very often. It's every approximately 2 years. It is the planet that retrogrades the least often. But it's very fun to just kind of think back to 2020, the autumn of 2020, the late months of 2020, and think about what was going on then, what you were exploring, what were some of the themes that were coming up for you. In relationship to now, we're 2 years later, we're in a totally different energetic. This time around, we have Mars moving through Gemini. And Mars entered Gemini initially on August 20th and will begin its retrograde on October 30th. And that will last until January 12th, 2023. And then Mars will start moving forward and will leave Gemini in late March 2023. So we're spending many, many months with Mars in Gemini. Just to give you a nice context of some of the things we're working with. Now, like I mentioned, there's a lot of conversation around Mars. Mars is connected to themes of motivation, desire, movement in life. I mean, Mars is also complicated in the fact that it is deeply tied to concepts of war and destruction. In traditional astrology, this is known as a malefic, which is an energetic that's kind of charged to have us move through challenge as a way of learning. And of course, life is challenging. I think we can all agree that we have our own unique definitions of what that has looked like for each of us. And, if we look around the world and what's going on, there are a lot of really, really painful things going on. And so, Mars, though, is a very layered energetic, right? Because it has these big categories that it's filling. And a lot of them, I think, are associated with, overwhelm and pain. However, here's the thing. Mars is also really beautiful because this is the energy that is about how we move through the world and what we want that to look like. But I think one thing that gets gets little acknowledgement when we're working with Mars as an archetype, as an energetic, is that everybody's definition of motivation, desire, and movement through the world is different, right? One of the problems we have when we're talking about a general transit like Mars retrograde is that we're going to place a cookie cutter kind of definition of what Mars is supposed to be, what we're supposed to feel like when Mars is direct, and what we're supposed to feel like when Mars is retrograde. But here's the thing, not all of us are going to desire the big house with the backyard and the picket fence, right? Not all of us are going to have motivation levels that involve getting to the top of the finance pyramid or, going back to school for a PhD or any of those things. And not all of us are going to want to move through life at the same speed. So we have to personalize the way that we work with these concepts of desire, motivation, and movement to understand ourselves and to work with it from that place. Because if we're working from Mars's perspective as just here's the speed, here are the desires, and here's what we should be moving toward in life, that's when Mars starts to become a little bit more destructive. And most of us have been taught the cultural foundation of what we should be desiring, how quickly we should be moving at it, and what we should be motivated by. Most of us learn to get motivated by a whole bunch of different things when we're very young children, by the larger culture. But this is a really great chance with Mars retrograde to get to review what we've been told we're supposed to desire, what we are told we are supposed to be motivated by, and what we are told we are supposed to be moving toward. It's also a really great time to question anything that has to do with the supposed to be timelines. We should be here by now. I should have done this by now. I should already know how to do X, Y, and Z perfectly by now. These kind of storylines, these shoulds, are where we are going to get some of our best reflection during the next couple of months. Now, this Mars retrograde is happening in Gemini, and Gemini is so much about the way that we tell story. We tell story to our friends, we tell stories in our inner family systems, the way that we tell stories in all the various forms, including the macro level of our culture. And that's why this is such a specifically important Mars retrograde, in that it is allowing us to really look at our storytelling around desire, motivation, timing, and movement through the world. And I just love that. I love that so much. And it gets me thinking once again about the standard conversation around Mars retrograde, where the fears there that we see coming up in the storytelling around Mars retrograde is that if I begin something new, if I try to be myself at this time, I will be shot down, I will be punished, I will be spotlighted as a failure. I will feel my shame. I should be ashamed that I didn't listen to this Mars retrograde and I tried to do something and it didn't work out, and that's what I get for doing it. That is essentially the messaging that comes up if you read anything that's talking about Mars retrograde in that way. And what we're really wanting to do is go a little bit bigger with this and look at that story and instead realize that we have a lot of storytelling around how highly we should be motivated, how quickly we should be moving, and who we are supposed to be. And in its deepest essence, this is a retrograde that is allowing us to rewrite the script around our shoulds and around the way that we think our timing should be playing out. I also think this Mars retrograde is going to be a time to realize you're further along than you thought. We spend a lot of energy in our lives thinking that we are behind. That time is running out, that we are behind, we're never going to catch up, we're never going to be good enough. We should have been doing those paintings 2 years ago. We should have already moved. We should have already been married or divorced, like whatever it is. There's always this fantastical timeline where we should have just been able to see the truth right away, move on it, make it happen, motivate ourselves through it, and be this perfect, always on time person. But this is a retrograde that also gives us an opportunity to feel on time in our own timing. This idea that Mars, right, which like I mentioned is about forward motion. It's about tearing down obstacles and jumping over obstacles and just making it through and facing right into the challenges of life. If that's always having to be going forward, we constantly have to be pursuing ourselves, running after this future version of ourselves that we are never in time for, that we're constantly behind. How exhausting is that? I think Mars retrograde also gives us an opportunity to own our timing, to get to be with the way that we are now and actually repeat a story that says, I'm on time, always, with myself. So I'm no longer trying to live on the timetable of all these other directives the culture has been giving me for decades. Those can go now. I'm allowed to be at peace. Another element that does come up with Mars retrograde is really deep honesty. I think all retrogrades are a time of deep honesty, and life itself is a practice of deep honesty. It's feeling the contrast of when we kind of don't listen to ourselves, we don't say what we really mean, and then when we do, and the difference in feeling between those two things. This Mars retrograde, specifically in this placement of Gemini, is going to be about really sitting down with ourselves and getting honest about what we actually want to be doing with our energy. Do we want to keep motivating ourselves by cracking that whip or by putting something just out of reach and then we're allowed to feel good? Are we afraid that, we're going to feel so much shame if we put something beautiful of ourselves out there and nobody wants it or everybody leaves? This is just a really beautiful time to get honest with ourselves about why we force ourselves to do something or why we are afraid to do something, and these are such deeply universal human themes that every single one of us grapples with, even if we don't see it on the external performance. And I think it's so contrary to this conversation about when Mars is retrograde that there's going to be this sense of manipulation. Because for me, it's not that at all. It's the exact opposite. Mars retrograde allows us to look at how we stoke our inner furnaces and how we force ourselves and motivate ourselves through all sorts of things. And even just this idea of motivation is something that I think at this moment, during this retrograde, we can put under the microscope and really look at and get curious about why we feel we have to motivate ourselves to get through, this huge doorway, to make it happen, to force ourselves into a certain shape and form. And overall, one of the important things here to just say is that there's never this wrong time to do something. This horrible wrong timing where, I have to wait until the new year when everything is direct and I feel better about myself so magically. Then I'll be allowed to do it. Then I'll no longer be afraid. Then I will be allowed to pursue it. I just want to throw that out right now. We're not working with that there's so much that has elapsed in life here on this earth, in our own individual lives as well as a collective. And here are just some of the summary of themes that you may notice as you are working with Mars retrograde in Gemini this year. The redirection of energy into unexpected and different pursuits. You may find that if you are not forcing yourself and you're not trying to motivate yourself with all the usual tactics to force your way through things that don't feel good, that your vision gets directed towards what really is connected to your inner light. And so what you're really wanting to do in life. And this can be subtle. It can just be a fascination. Like I've recently had a fascination with pandas. You know, didn't see that one coming necessarily, specifically pandas, but there it is. Letting go of actions or routines that feel heavy. So if there's something that we're forcing ourselves to keep doing, we keep showing up to that coffee date with that friend every week, even though that friendship's feeling wonky, we may stop doing it. Emotional honesty, the space to feel emotions. You know, Mars direct, it's going to be like, we don't have time for emotions, right? The symbolism there is that it's time for action. It's time to push through. It's time to make it happen. Mars retrograde allows us the time to feel our emotions about where we feel exhausted, where we feel demotivated, and where we are longing to just be held. Not as the outsider trying to earn our worth in the world, but as a being who is in perfect time with themselves. The compassion there is so potent and beautiful. That's the other thing, compassion for the performer, compassion for our external self that is always out there, putting on a brave face, making it look pulled together. This is a time to give it a break. I think also authentic connection. This is a time of really deep, honest conversation and connection and storytelling and review and understanding at a deeper level. I think on the macro lens, which I think is a really important aspect of this transit, we have the reassessment of norms of productivity and performance. Now, this is kind of piggybacking off of a lot of the things we've been exploring with Saturn in Aquarius, which is really interesting. But we are going to be thinking about how we value ourselves, how we value our productivity, and how we think of ourselves as worthy of rest and peace, and what we think we are supposed to do in order to be normal, to be on time with this mythic, idealized future self that we keep trying to catch up to. And of course, finally, there are going to be cultural lens shifts during this time, and they're already happening. There's a lot of these kind of clashes going on in the world right now that are really, really gut-wrenching, and the situation in Iran right now, which has been going on for decades, is just reaching this heightened state. Of course, the war in Ukraine. These are things that are they're full of pain and they're full of confusion. And, you think about Mars, the god of war, and Mars is this planet of a bit of destruction and tension. We can also think about how these kind of moments of tension are really helping us to shift our cultural lens about what we think of as normal, and what we cannot think of as normal any longer, because it feels like it's from another time. It feels outdated. It feels in the past. It feels heavy. It feels painful because of that. So there's also a clarifying around realizing, oh yeah, we're holding all these cultural lenses. And we can do that even, when I was 15, I remember, Bridget Jones was out, the movie version. And there was a lot of talk about spinsters, women who were past 25. In the US, right? Or Britain or Europe. It's oh, you're single? Wow, it's really past time for you. Those conversations now sound very, very strange to a lot of us, right? Because we're no longer valuing people based on their relationship status nearly at the same level. And I'm sure that's not completely true, but on a larger scale, right? That's shifted. So this is also a time where we can just think about those bigger shifts on the much larger macro scale. So finally, I just want to say, this is a time to deeply create from a source of light within you, not to motivate yourself, not to force the timeline, not to become something else, but to really create from our core. and only create from our core. And that's the ideal, right? Of course, we're going to still, have to slog through some things. A lot of us are going to end up slogging through things. Let's be real, right? Like, this is not going to be the space where I say, just, chill out. It's fine. I realize a lot of you out there are having a slog. I feel you. But the more we can create from the core, or whatever that is, and you may not be motivated by what everybody else is motivated by or by what a lot of people are motivated by. You might have very little motivation right now. That's okay. That's honesty. All right. Like, I'm not motivated by most of the things in this world. I'll tell you what, like, I don't find motivation easily, actually. For me, I just want to be at peace and walk through nature. Most of us are feeling that way. So it's just about connecting to our core and not feeling like we have to perform constantly. And isn't that just a beautiful thing? Isn't that more trust rather than less? So I also want you, anytime you see those trauma repeating stories coming up in the coming weeks with Mars retrograde, really question them. A lot of times, the thing that's interesting about astrology is that any practitioners, it's a mirror of the practitioner, the way that they speak about different transits. All of these systems are mirrors. They help all of us mirror in ourselves and see what's going on. But you'll often find the way that something is discussed is going to be a direct mirror of whoever is talking about it. So just keep that in mind in the coming weeks and, make this your own. Make Mars retrograde yours and no one else's. I am going to be leading a Zoom call with my upper tier on Patreon during this Mars stationing retrograde. So I'd love to see you there. I think I'll also be offering up some breakdowns of this transit that you can just read over and take with you. So if you want to join me on Patreon, I would love to see you there. You can also find me on Instagram and on my website, so I'll leave all the links below so you know where to find me. Thanks for hanging out for this whole long chat that we've been doing. I had so much on my mind that it took a while for me to get it all out there, but there it is. I hope you have a beautiful coming couple of months. We'll be back for more chats in the very near future. I'd love to see you here again so soon. Take it easy. Take care of yourselves.